Welcome to this episode of Kill the Cat. This is part one of a two-part series on the John Wick film franchise. For this episode, we're going to look at how the films build a fantasy world through the use of myth, legend, and reimagined archetypes. As always, spoilers ahead for the first three movies, but if you've seen them, then enjoy the episode. Welcome to Kill the Cat. I'm Ibby, and this is Cat.
I am Cat. This podcast is not about killing me, believe it or not. It's about screenwriting and filmmaking.
Yes, and today we are talking about John Wick. We're taking a little bit of a different approach. I think the normal thing to talk about in John Wick is how great the action is, how great the cinematography is, all that kind of stuff. But we want to talk about building a fantasy world.
Yeah, so you pitched this to me. We were tossing around ideas what to do for our next episode. And you said, what about doing how to build a fantasy world but use John Wick? And I was immediately on board for that idea. So, bit of an odd angle to come at. It's not technically a fantasy. If you want to define fantasy, it's meant to have magic or supernatural elements that aren't meant to scare you. The moment it's meant to scare you, it becomes a horror. John Wick doesn't have any of that, but it has pretty much everything else a really great fantasy world has.
Yeah, and it's a fantasy film hidden within an action film, or it's an action film that has a fantasy world. And yeah, I think that it just adds to the interest of the movie and takes it kind of beyond your standard action flick, even though it's a brilliant action flick. So we're going to talk sort of about the set of movies. So 1 to 3, because number 4 hasn't come out. If you're listening in like 2 years and it has, maybe all of this will be irrelevant and they'll be terrible by that point.
Never.
Probably
I refuse to live in that world.
It goes without saying, there are a lot of things that work in these movies. The cinematography works. The stunts, they work. Keanu Reeves is a brilliant stunt performer. The directors are both come from a stunt directing background, so they know what they're doing. The soundtrack is probably one of my favorite action soundtracks. Like, it's just a really interesting, intense kind of sound. And the world building works really well. There are a couple of things that don't really work as well. The very original script, and we're probably reading an early draft, because it's kind of hard to find a later draft for this film. Not the best script in the world.
No. So the one we found is from 2015. It's called Scorn. It's very different. I'm not going to say it's a bad script in itself. It's definitely coming from a mind of someone who is seeing the finished picture, I would say. We talked a little bit in our Princess Bride episode about how that screenplay just feels like a complete experience in itself, and it was a delightful read. This is definitely more of this is a blueprint for something I see in my head. I really don't like the first 10 pages and the first 10 minutes of an otherwise almost flawless action movie. It was actually funny going back and rewatching the first one, which is one of my favorite films ever, to the point where, like, if I could have made a film, like any film, I would probably, it might be cheating, but I might just pick the John Wick franchise as like the film I could have made. And I really don't like the first 10 minutes.
They are very, they're a bit tropey.
I think this comes from doing so much editing of like student films. It has every student film trope down to the, like, having an alarm clock to start off your script is a cliche to the point where, like, that it's cliche has become cliche, and yet it's somehow made its way into this movie. It doesn't not work.
But this is the thing. Somehow they kind of pull it off in the movie. Like, when you're looking at that and when you become aware of it, you're like, during the first 10 minutes, because like the whole setup, the wife has died and there's photos of her and he's looking at her on the phone, and the cut to the flashback montage of her in the hospital room and all that. It's been done a million times, and it's been done very badly a million times. My suspicion is they found the way to pull it off in the edit. It feels very much, comparing the script to the final film, like they kind of had everything filmed and then went, actually, you know what this needs to be? This needs to be montage. This needs to be shorter. We need to cut out all of the scenes of John Wick crying, because there are a whole bunch of them.
Oh, God, yes. Drinking whiskey, looking in the mirror and crying. Please stop putting this in scripts. It's not deep, I'm sorry. It's just overdone.
I mean, he does cry at one point, and we feel for him at that moment. But you can't really start there. And I think one of the other things that kind of changes from the script to the film is that John Wick becomes a much more almost understated character. Like in the script, he was very sort of openly aggressive and very like confrontational. In the movie, he's very confrontational. He kills a whole lot of people. But he doesn't kind of talk as much. He's much more just kind of a force that's there, and you don't want to mess with him, and you're aware that you don't want to mess with him, but he will mess you up if you stand in his way. And I think that makes for a better and more interesting character and a more interesting film.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll go into this a bit later, this kind of idea of this fallen angel or this lone hero type, which is quite common in fantasy. The equivalents I had in my notes, Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher was kind of the one that came to mind. To a lesser extent, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. Definitely not as violent. Yeah. But I'm thinking like Ryder Aragorn in the very beginning when he's off on his lonesome. But we're labeling this fantasy, so should we talk about what makes a fantasy?
Yes.
But this is definitely an action film, but we're exploring it as a fantasy, and there's definitely things that make up a great fantasy, or any fantasy world really, in any genre. And this is kind of the basics of what you need. I actually approached this as like, if I was building this as a Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
We talk about Dungeons and Dragons a lot on this podcast.
Yes, we do. I have no regrets. What do you need for that world? And John Wick kind of ticked all these boxes. So the first one I had on my list was like, it has its own currency.
Yeah, the coins and the markers even. It's interesting that the coins they're a very obscure form of currency. It's kind of like, it can mean you clean up a dead body, or it can mean a stay at the Continental.
There's a quote from the third one, and they're talking about the coins, and it's they're called the commerce of relationships, a social contract in which you agree to partake, order and rules.
Which is one of the big themes of the film, especially as we get into the third film. Yeah,
and then they also have the markers as well as a form of currency. You can owe someone almost like a blood debt or a blood oath.
Yeah, the quote from the second movie, to grant a marker is to bind the soul to a blood oath. And then Winston later on is saying, two rules that can't be broken: no business conducted on the Continental grounds, and every marker must be honoured. And we see that in John Wick 2 at the start, where he's presented the marker and kind of like he has to take it. He tries to not take it, his house gets blown up, and then he has to take it. But in the third one, he presents his marker to Sophia, and she has to take it despite everything kind of being like you don't do this.
Yeah, and that's quite a common trope in fantasy, to give someone your blood is to give them control over you. It's quite a common plot point in the Name of the Wind series, and definitely in others. And of course, I think we've all heard of the idea of blood having control. It's why we have vampires. Yeah,
and there's also like Cassian has Gianna as a ward, and so when John kills her, it's like it's an eye for an eye, and so Cassian has to kill John, which is just a great sequence in my books.
Yeah, I heard the director refer to Cassian as what John would have become if he'd stayed in the game.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really interesting take on that.
And he feels like that. He does feel like that.
That is one of my favourite fight sequences. It's just them, the first fight after Rome. And I remember sitting in the cinema watching them tumble down the stairs.
Yeah.
And it's just one long take.
I just love when they then eventually just break through into the Continental, and it's like, oh, this fight is over now.
Like, let's have a drink.
Yeah.
They just have a drink together.
Yeah. It's like, I'm still going to try and kill you. Okay. But they have a drink together.
Yeah, that comes down to honor, which is like another really common theme going throughout these films, and like much more common in fantasy than it would be in contemporary films.
It's the third one does it a lot with Zero and his men. When in the sort of end of the movie, when they're fighting John Wick, like there's a moment where they knock him down, they help him back up, and they actually find more honor and joy in the art of like fighting this legendary character than just like straight up trying to kill him. and Zero is like fanboying the whole time.
That was such an interesting choice for a character, and it works so well.
I feel like it's the subversion of expectations in this movie, right? You expect everyone to just be super serious, but Zero then comes out with like, I'm a huge fan. John Wick, come on.
So another thing I noticed is the language of John Wick. They have a really specific way of speaking, and even in the original Scorn script from 2015, some of this cadence and old-fashioned language crept through. Lines like, so Winston says to Perkins, by thine own hand, revoked. Another Winston line is like, this kingdom is mine and mine alone. And then the second one, Gianna says, this woman whose life has ended my own, was she worth the price that you now seek to pay? These are very poetic, old-fashioned quotes.
The language really does add to, I think, a lot of the themes that go on in this movie, because they're such fantasy-esque themes like honor and duty and debt. They kind of hold a lot more weight than, I think to sort of, if you were to watch some standard modern set action movie and they were to talk about honor or debt, it'd be like, yeah, okay. But we don't really talk about that these days. Like, they aren't themes that we hold as tightly in, I guess, the modern world. So when you hear them talk about these themes with language that actually matches the kind of old world fantasy that we're used to, I feel like that adds a lot more weight to, I guess, the characters' beliefs in these themes. And it becomes a lot more believable that they would hold to them so closely that, Cassian and John would stop fighting immediately as soon as they realize they're on continental ground, things like that.
So you have all this very like rich old-fashioned language, and then you have the subtitles, which for some reason, I thought I was going crazy at first. Watching it on Netflix, they're gone. Did you have this?
They're gone in the first one, but they're there in the third one.
Yeah. It's so strange.
Yeah.
I'm like, why did you remove the stylized subtitles?
Yeah. I wonder if you turned on the subtitles, if they'd reappear.
Maybe. I did have the subtitles on.
But I feel like they are a part of the experience as well. It's a very interesting way to do cross-language kind of thing and make it land a bit harder. Like, it's suddenly not just, oh, they're talking another language and that's okay. It's like, oh no, this is important. Like, this is something here.
That's so true. It's another thing that like shouldn't work, having like different sized and coloured fonts in your subtitles.
But they just commit to it and it kind of works.
It definitely
I feel like sometimes that's the key. Just like, you commit. You know what you're doing, you commit, and it'll work. That could be very bad advice for some things, but
that's true.
In this case, it wasn't.
Yeah. And this idea that these characters are speaking a slightly different language to ours and live in a slightly different world, or a very different world in some ways to the one we live in.
I think, speaking on that, like, one of the things that makes it fantasy is that it's a world so close to our own, and that's something we talk about in the Harry Potter world building episode, is the idea that actually it's a world that's kind of runs in conjunction to our own. And one of the things that John Wick does really well, especially in the first movie, is that we kind of see a little bit of this world. We get like just snippets and tastes, but the world is there, and so we get to see, oh, hang on, there's something going on under the surface of our own world. And we're completely ignorant to it, but everyone else seems to be aware of it.
Yeah, we don't get a taste for that. We don't get a taste of that as well in the first film until about 30 minutes in. And it's just, hey, John, you working again?
Hey, John. Hey, Jimmy. I do love that in the second movie when Jimmy asks the same question again. He's like, you working again? And John just kind of leaves like, shit.
Yeah.
But
it's just that first hint of like, okay, it's not quite the world we thought we lived in. By the way, sorry, small tangent. Going back to like not liking the first 10 pages of the screenplay, the first interesting thing happens about 10 pages, and it's when it's not when the puppy gets delivered, but just before that, when the delivery woman gives John a pen to sign and he doesn't give it back. That is the first indication of character. Yeah,
which is, I don't think I ever picked up on it as being an indication of character until I read the script and was like,
because it's a weapon.
Yeah.
He's not going to give you back your weapon. And it's just it's a subconscious thing as well. He's like, oh, right, yeah, of course. Take your pen.
I love one of my favorite moments was there's like multiple points where it's talked about that John had like killed people with a pencil. Like Ibrahim in the second movie in the intro, he's like, he killed 3 people with a pencil. With a fucking pencil. Who does that?
John Wick, apparently.
Yeah. And then in the second movie, at one point, he kills 2 people with a pencil. I'm like, this is just paid off. Like, this has been set up for 2 movies and this has paid off so well. It's very violent, but I'm so glad that this was added to the scene.
It's such a weird thing. We're like, oh, this is violent, but I'm cheering it for some reason. Another thing I noticed this time around going into the rewatch, thinking of it as fantasy, is the very specific locations it shows in terms of setting. Everywhere important they end up, there's less of this in the first movie. There's more disused warehouses and docks and that kind of thing. But definitely more in the second and third. For example, the assassination of Gianna is held in the catacombs of Rome. The Continental feels old, almost like it's timeless.
Yeah, it's like this Gothic cathedral-like structure that is... Yeah.
And all the architecture is kind of like that. And then the second one, it's much more like ancient Western architecture. I think there's no coincidence that they end up in Rome.
Yeah.
And then in the third one, it focuses more on kind of Eastern fantasy and going more into that feeling of the old East, especially in like Casablanca.
And especially as John gets pulled more and more back into the world, we start to see more and more of those interesting locations. So I think the first movie is kind of allowed to be sort of like we're still on the edges very much of the world, and we only really get to see the world properly when we go to Vigo, like when or when we're directly in the Continental or that club underneath the Continental. But yeah, number 3, everything is interesting. Like even almost every fight scene is like really interesting in the third movie.
Yeah, like the Roscaroma is beautiful with all the ballet dancing and you're just walking through. Architecture is gorgeous, and yeah, it just gives the whole world of John Wick a feeling like it's been there for
a long
centuries, maybe even longer than our own world, which is very common. Like if you think, this reminded me a lot of like when we went into this Cassandra Clare's City of Bones series, which is a YA series, but that focused on kind of like the idea of like demon hunters and demons and vampires and stuff living in New York that's not our New York.
Yeah.
And it's been here for so long, and I get that feel from this world as well.
And that's a very common fantasy flavor, right? Of like, you have these places and, kind of the unseen forces and kingdoms that just continue to exist hidden away. Whether that's, an alternate dimension that you can only see once you've kind of undergone a certain trial or process, or whether that is just something underneath the city that you only discover by venturing down. Like it's a process to get into the world. It's never you just can see it. Hogwarts and the Wizarding World is a perfect example of that, right? Like it's this world that's just kind of there and you'll never notice it because you're not meant to notice it.
Yeah, you're either part of it or you're not.
And once you're in it, you can't leave. No one leaves. Except John Wick, because no one's going to stop him leaving.
He got out and then they killed his dog and he came back.
Yeah.
They killed his dog and stole his car.
I'm so glad he doesn't get his car back until the end of like the second movie this time, because in the original Scorn script he gets his car back like instantly. I'm like, guys, that's not fun. Like,
he has to fight for it.
Yeah, good choice in making it the second movie. I also love in the second movie when he does get his car back, like it is ruined and he uses it to like run over some guys, and like just him pulling it up into the garage at his home just completely destroyed is like such a character statement of like, actually this meant so much for him, he was willing to like destroy it to kind of get vengeance. I reckon the car's coming back because Aurelio's still got the car.
Oh yeah, in the fourth one.
Yeah.
We'll put that in our theories for John Wick 4. I had in my notes his car as his steed. Going back to the Witcher reference, it's like his roach.
Yeah.
Don't touch roach.
What is the knight without his steed?
Yeah.
He stole his car and killed his dog.
I think we're okay with the violence to answer our earlier question. It's because a dog died.
It's like
A puppy died and people had to pay.
I don't think anything is going to justify that more for people than a puppy dying. It's like, they killed a puppy. How could they? You will all die.
77 people will die.
63.
63?
I think it's 63 in the first movie.
I believe you. I just made that number up.
I think by the end of the third movie, though, it's over 300.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
I like how they call it out in the third movie and they're like, all this for a puppy? It's like, it wasn't just a puppy. And then later when Sophia's dog almost gets shot, it's like, he shot my dog. And John Wick's just like,
I get it.
Yeah. Little other things for setting up your fantasy world. The certain way people dress.
Yeah.
I had John Wick's suit as his armor.
Yeah, and you notice him get new armor in the second movie, and then in the third movie he gets another set of new armor, and it's
from the Elder, and it's almost like mythical armor.
Mm.
And you see him. I'm pretty sure this happens. You see him get shot in the third movie, and it just kind of bounces off. It happens so fast.
Does it bounce off? I think it you see it hit, and then it kind of gets stuck to, and then it falls off.
That would be.
It's when Sophia shoots him.
Yes, that, and also just the way all the people dressed is like I loved the combination of like piercings and tattoos with like formal office wear almost.
Yeah, like I don't know what to call them, but the operators.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah, the operators. Their whole look is so interesting and so like this world. Like it's such a great taste of what this world is, and then the marrying of that with the like vacuum tubes and old school PCs and old school phones, like rotary telephones. I think they have some rotary and some like button telephones.
Yeah. They're using a blackboard to keep track of things.
But it's like it kind of feeds into that idea of like it's been there for such a long time. But then also on like a really practical level, like that is such a better way to hide your world. Because you're not on the internet.
Yeah, it's all offline. And I love how they're all kind of dressed. They look like women from the 50s. Like they're wearing pink button-up shirts and their hair is very 50s. And they're just covered like in tattoos and piercings.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
Like you sent all the goths back to the 50s.
Yes.
And got them to dress as operators. Who else is in this? There's the operators.
Let's talk characters.
I labeled this kind of as like reskinned archetypes. Is what they kind of did with the characters. So you have your John Wick, who is the hero, but he's not the classic hero who stands for, justice and righteousness. He's the sort of darker, fallen hero who's actually surviving and fighting for himself and, kind of accidentally falls into maybe saving the world if he does. One of the first characters we meet that really feels mythical is the cleaner, Charlie.
Yes.
When John kind of hands him the coins and he's like, are you back in the game, we get this first taste of like the world that is. We have the Bowery King in the second movie.
Amazing performance by Lawrence Fishburne.
Amazing. He's very Oracle-like. He's the knower of all things, and he's actually slightly removed from the, he comes under the high table, but he actually kind of feels separate to it, and that kind of tracks, I think, in a lot of fantasy. When you think of like the Oracle characters, they are these powerful characters that are kind of like to the side of the kingdoms and the sort of official structures that the hero might encounter. Are two of our antagonists, and I think this is a side note. I think contemporary fantasy is doing a lot to become a lot more diverse. They're more targeted at kids, but things like Steven Universe and The Dragon Prince are very big on involving characters who are, not straight, or who are people of color, or who are, people with disabilities, and just, not all the heroes are men. Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, 2 female characters, I think.
Yeah, how many in the Fellowship of the Ring? 12, and none of them are women.
Yeah,
It was the times, and it's still a great fantasy series, but it's a great movement that we're seeing where we're actually starting to involve these characters, and these films do it. The second and third do it a lot better than the first one does it. The first one is still very white and very masculine, but the second one we have Ares, who is our sort of super badass antagonist, and she's mute, but it doesn't take away from anything she does. And I do love the moment where she's in the bar and like she signs, I can't remember what she signs, but John signs back, and it's this moment of like, oh shit, he can sign too.
Yeah. Because John Wick can do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love her a lot. One of my favourite characters in all the films is the Adjudicator.
Mm-hmm.
I want all their clothing. I wish I could just shave my head and wear beautiful black clothing and look the way they do.
Because they pull it off amazingly.
Amazing.
Yeah. And the Adjudicator is just such a brilliant character. And going back to kind of like, okay, what's their role in the fantasy setting? Well, they are the sort of Inquisitor character, right? They represent the system, and they represent order and the status quo, and they actually kind of hold all power from the throne or the kings, or in this case, the high table. And everyone kind of has to bow to them because of what they represent. The performance is brilliant. And it's such an interesting character to watch as John is trying to go through his thing and trying to survive. This character is then just kind of following everywhere that he's been and like making people pay penance.
There's a cut scene from the third one. I haven't found it. It was just in an interview. They also go to the doctor that tells John where the medicine is. Apparently it slowed the film down too much. It was one too many cutbacks to New York.
It's a very slow film already, but yes.
Yeah. But they do also go back to the doctor.
Yeah.
Just told him where the medicine was. That's all he did. And justice still comes from him. I really liked, talking about like it's fantasy but not quite fantasy, the perfect balance. The Adjudicator almost feels otherworldly, but not quite. There's a little bit of emotion there. Just a touch, just enough to be like, they are technically human. Yeah. But still feel very removed. Mm-hmm. And that kind of judge,
they
judge
have
archetype.
to sit above everything because of their role. The end of the third movie is, I think, where you see the most humanity coming out of them, in the moment where it's like, John Wick isn't in the alleyway. And they and Winston are both like, we need to deal with this. So I'm interested to see where that character goes in the fourth movie.
I wonder if they'll come back.
It's an interesting change from Ares in the second movie, because the Adjudicator isn't a fighter.
That's very true.
They don't do any fighting. They purely judge and deliver penance to those who have helped John.
I bet you they can fight.
I don't know.
That would be
we
cool.
have not seen everything the Adjudicator can do. I don't know if they can
not
fight,
by a long shot.
but we have not seen the sort of end of what they can do. And so you'd be silly to get rid of them or not feature them as antagonist for the next movie or however many movies they make. Another character we have is the director of the Ruska Roma, who is kind of the classic like matriarch. She has all the orphans. And she trains the orphans and raises the orphans, and you get the interesting dynamic of the orphan who's kind of left and has to come back to the orphanage in the third movie when John has to deliver his, not his marker, his ticket.
Yes.
And then he's branded as having used the ticket and is no longer allowed to return. The elder is a very interesting character as well.
Definitely the most fantasy of all the characters we've talked about, almost on a mythical level.
One of the big tropes of myth, you find this a lot in like John Campbell talks about this heaps, but the idea of like death and rebirth is a very big theme in a lot of religions, and that is the process for meeting the elder, is go to the edge of the desert and walk, and then when you can't walk anymore, keep going until you are about to die. And then if he wants to find you, he will find you. And John has to go do that. I don't think they kind of play that out as dramatically as they could. He kind of just like eventually collapses and then he gets found by a guy with a camel.
But the movie's long enough already. Yeah. There could have been more.
They could have, maybe. But yeah, he's this sort of very mythical creature, sort of sits above everything else in the world. He's like the puppet master kind of character. He
feels like the god.
Yeah.
In a way. Deserts, very famously in literature, are the places you go to seek guidance. And kind of the say,
I think immediately to like Lion King when Simba sees Mufasa in the sky.
Ritual, and as well, very powerful throughout these films. So just because we've touched on it a little bit. So the ritual, meeting the elder, walking till you can't walk anymore and then keep walking, removing his ring finger.
Simultaneously, I'm like, I understand why they did that. I'm also like, guys, that is just a visual effects nightmare for every film from now on.
That's so true. Maybe he'll wear gloves.
I mean, like, maybe you do an Avengers and give him a fake finger, but that feels a little bit beyond this world to me. I think this world is too fantasy and not sci-fi enough for that.
I think he will wear his penance proudly. He won't get a replacement or a fake finger.
No.
It's a mark. Yeah, the idea of like tearing the ticket and then he gets branded.
Yeah. Even the penances that people have to pay in the third one. I think the third one is where we see ritual the most.
Yeah.
I think it does exist in the others. Things like, we'll talk about the penance first, so the almost all the penances involve blood. So for the director, her hands are pierced through. For the Bowery King, he gave John 7 bullets, so he gets 7 cuts. And we presume him dead until the end of the movie, and he comes back in super, super cool.
He's all scarred, but in a cool way.
Yeah.
Because it's John Wick.
No one can be scarred in an uncool way.
Of course.
That wouldn't be good. But yeah, going back to like the first movie, like making a dinner reservation.
Oh yeah.
For Charlie or for the cleaner. I think his name is Charlie. He comes up and you pay a coin per body. And what other rituals are there?
We've already talked about the marker quite a lot, that ritual.
I love the actual physicality of the ritual, right? Like the marker has a small blade to pierce the finger and to place the blooded fingerprint on it. And that's how you do that.
All the props in this film as well feel so ancient and like they're from another time.
Like they were designed eons before and the tradition has just held to this point.
Yeah, and I actually was going into this thinking there was definitely another version of this film that bordered on sci-fi that could have been, where there's advanced weapons. I'm thinking like Minority Report.
Yeah.
But you go into this world and there's like super advanced weapons, but we don't really see any of that. It's just guns, knives.
I think we see
horse.
a tiny...
Twice.
Oh my god. The horse is probably one of my favorite additions to number 3. When he like smacks the horse and it kicks a guy in the head.
And then he does it again. Because why not? It worked.
I remember seeing, after I'd watched the second one, a photo came out from production and it looked like someone had just captured it on an iPhone or something. But there's John Wick on a horse with a person on a motorbike next to him. And I'm just like, I don't know if this is photoshopped, but I really hope it's not. I'm pretty sure I told you about it when I saw it. I'm like, this is ridiculous. And I'm so in for this.
So remember the shot from the trailer for the third one where he's on a horse on a motorway surrounded by motorbikes and then the motorcycle riders pull swords.
Yeah. What? Why?
These movies are amazing.
Yeah. It's crazy that John Wick is pulling off these sort of big moments. Because I think of another movie that tries to do this and like one-up itself every time. It's like the Fast and Furious franchise.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't land. Like that franchise is not landing.
I'm not gonna lie, I've seen the first one once, I think.
I've seen...
Maybe the third one.
I've seen most of them. Number 2 was surprisingly hard to watch. Did we get through all the rituals?
I was saying there's a version of this that could be sci-fi.
Yeah, I don't know that it would have worked as well.
Oh no,
as
I definitely think it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
I just think I could have seen that temptation to go in that direction as opposed to the more fantasy direction.
Yeah. Which I don't know that the fantasy thing is something we've seen done this well. Like we've seen the sci-fi action come together a whole bunch, but it's rare to see fantasy that feels so like old world fantasy-ish combined with like modern action.
And I think like a big part of that is the way it gets presented to us, this world.
Yeah. One of the very common ways to introduce a fantasy world is to provide us with an ignorant protagonist. So this happens in Harry Potter.
Percy Jackson, City of Bones I mentioned before. Yeah,
it happens even in Lord of the Rings. Like Frodo's quite ignorant beyond the Shire.
Yeah. Another one, and this actually made me think of this, is Neverwhere, the Neil Gaiman novel, which focuses very much on a world within a world with an ignorant protagonist.
I haven't read it.
Oh, it's a great book. I mean, he's one of my favourite authors, so I recognise. We should do a Neil Gaiman film at some point. I digress. Ignorant protagonists.
Yeah, Luke from Star Wars, Neo from The Matrix, also Keanu Reeves. Maybe they're the same person. Who knows?
Maybe Neo has just finally given up and gone and made a deal to go into his own like fantasy world where he is John Wick.
Yeah. It's just like done with this. He's like, still want to be a badass, but I just like, I'll go into the Matrix again.
You can harvest my body for energy. It's fine as long as my mind thinks that I'm John Wick.
Look.
I mean, that's not a bad deal.
No. Coming back to the idea. So the common way to introduce a fantasy world is with an ignorant protagonist, someone who goes into the world, knows nothing about it, so that as they learn about it, we learn about it. Great for engaging your audience. Great for building an immersive world if you're J.K. Rowling, building the Harry Potter series. This movie takes the complete opposite way of doing things and somehow pulls it off really well in that everyone in the world knows how the world works. No one has to ask a question about how the world works. The only people who don't know how the world works is us, the audience. And so we only get to really understand the world by watching it. And that's kind of what sucks us in, is like, oh, coins are a thing. What's the value of coin? Where do you get coins? Who has coins? Like, where did the coins come from? And, you know, all those questions come out of just John handing 12 coins to Charlie. You know, it's all these little things that pull us in. And it's interesting that it's the complete opposite track to the ignorant protagonist, but it brings us in just as much.
This is definitely the harder one to do. I see a lot of short films attempt it. I've attempted it in a short film. Didn't go great.
Yeah.
Exposition on my first short film was rough.
I think what John Wick did well to make this happen is that this method takes time. Like, this is the method that works in a TV show. This is the method that works when you have 3 movies to do it. You know, John Wick 1 doesn't really go too far into the world. It gives us little glimpses and then just leaves us to be like, this is a world and you don't need to know more about it than just John Wick gives a coin and something happens and there's like a favor given to him back. It's only once you start getting to the second movie and the third movie where it's like, actually, we need to reveal a little bit more of the world. I do think the second movie is probably the weakest out of the 3. I think it builds a lot of stuff in the world, but doesn't really give us as much payoff with those things as it maybe could. I think the third movie kind of brought it back for me and suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I'm back in this now.
I think one of the things that really works for that is it kind of makes you feel smart for having to put all the pieces together yourself. I definitely feel going into a lot of movies when it's the exposition scene. Like, exposition's really tough. There's some ways are definitely better than others. There's very few films like this one that can just skip it and expects you to catch up without losing you. And I think that's part of the reason the John Wick films feel so cool. Like, they're just cool movies. And I think it's because at no point do I feel someone behind the camera or behind the script being like, look at this amazing world I've done and let me lay it all out for you. And I really respect that there's no voiceover, there's no titles, no ignorant protagonist, but there's also no sidekick, there's no love interest, he doesn't talk out loud to the dog, there's none of that.
Yeah.
They just took every easy route out of it. And they just toss you in the middle and you have to figure it out. And I think you were saying before, if they didn't do this and they tried to explain everything, we both reckon the world would probably just fall apart.
Yeah, as a writer or as someone trying to build a story world, there is a certain point where every world falls apart. No world is perfect. The Harry Potter world, you can analyze to a point where it will fall apart. The Matrix world will fall apart eventually. Star Wars world will fall apart eventually. If you really want to take the time to look at how does the economy work in this world? How does the politics work in this world? You know, Star Wars 1, 2, and 3. But every world is going to break. And so the more you give your world, the more likely it is to break. And so by withholding and only giving the pieces that are needed, one, you are kind of making your audience feel like, oh, I'm a bit clever for catching this. But 2, you're making them ask questions and go, oh, wait, why did that work? Or what's that? And those are the things that are going to make it more interesting. I think Lost is a really good example of this. The first few seasons, you really are just constantly asking questions. And then you get to the last season and they actually have to try and answer a bunch of questions. And that's the season a lot of people dropped off before that. But I got
to the end. It was not worth it. I'm so sorry, Lost writers. I enjoyed so much of what you did.
Yeah, so much of it was brilliant. But it was that thing of like, once they answered all the questions, the world fell apart. And so by not answering every question and just answering the ones that you need to answer, I think world building happens better that way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think sometimes the most fun and the best parts of worlds like this is when you don't have all the answers, because anything is possible and any answer is possible. And so my favorite like piece of media content in this world ever is a podcast called Welcome to Night Vale. Amazing. Go check it out. It's brilliant. But the more episodes they made and the more they began to explain the world, because they kind of have to after doing it for 8 years. I still love it. It's not as fun as the first episodes where you just have no idea what's going on, because it's this wonderful world that you have no idea what's going on. And once they kind of got into maybe where the mythology of this whole world came from, still good, not as fun. And I really think that's where John Wick is treading on kind of this idea of like anything could be possible. You don't have all the answers. Yeah.
I think that's the challenge John Wick and the writers and directors have going forward as well, though. Like, how do you, because you have to walk this balance of like the more movies you make, the more of your world you reveal. How do you not reveal so much that it falls apart while revealing enough to keep it interesting? I don't have the answer for them.
Yeah, they said they're going to keep making them as long as they keep getting funded, which I'm totally okay with.
Yeah, look, I feel like the action is keeping me there. Keanu Reeves is keeping me there. I could forgive the world. But until the world falls apart, it's a really good and interesting world that is being delivered really well.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about myth. I think that's a big thing we had in both our notes that we haven't really touched on yet.
Yeah. So what are myths? Myths, I think in the simplest form, are the stories that people tell. And there are different purposes for myths. One of the things I think works really well in this movie is that John Wick is a mythical character. And he is introduced as such. In the original script for Scorn, and I mentioned this before, that he's kind of much more direct, and he kind of talks about himself, not talks about himself, but like will outwardly state his intentions, and you see him kill a bunch of people before anyone ever talks about him. In the movie, and I think the stronger thing is that actually you hear people talk about him before you see him do anything. And it's almost like this like payoff of like all these things that people have said about him, and then you see him actually dealing with the like 12 guys who come to take him out in his house, and you're like, oh shit. And there's so many myths. I wrote a bunch of them down, especially in the first one. People talk about him a lot. Aurelio, when Yosef comes in, is like, you stole from, did you kill him? Like this idea that if you've done anything to mess with this guy, you better have killed him and like made sure he is not coming back, because you don't want that. When Vigo calls Aurelio and is like, why did you hit my son? And he's like, he stole John Wick's car and killed his dog. And Vigo just says, oh. It's this brilliant moment and gives us so much about who John Wick is. The name of Baba Yaga, and the fact that the like line about he wasn't the boogeyman, he was the man you sent to kill the boogeyman.
That's such a good line.
And then watching, Vigo say he's a man of focus and commitment and sheer will, as John Wick is just like cracking through the cement in his basement to get his stuff out. Just this like scene that just builds you up of like, who is this guy and what's about to happen?
Yeah, there's literally a line at some point where he is referred to as John Wick, the man, the myth, the legend. He's commonly referred to as the Angel of Death. It's never said in the movies. It's in the first script.
Yeah.
It's a term I've heard tossed around, though, when people describe him. Yeah. Angel of Death, Artist of Death is another one I've heard.
Zero it says that they are both masters of death in the third movie. Another one from the first movie is like, Vigo says, John is coming for you. You will do nothing because you can do nothing. It's like, yeah. And just the idea that everyone knows him as well, right? Like, no matter where he goes, like in the third movie, he jumps in a taxi to go to the library at the like very start, and the taxi like is going nowhere because of traffic. He hands over a coin for them to take the dog to the Continental. And the taxi driver's like, have a good night, Mr. Wick. And it's like, even this taxi driver in New York City knows who John Wick is. We still don't know how far the myth goes of who he is.
Yeah, there's a fun thing in this world as well, that everyone knows everyone. At no point is John being like, who is this? Tell me who this is. He knows all the people he's going to see and all the people who are coming after him.
At the end of the third one, we start to see a little bit of where John has his knowledge isn't maybe keeping up. And only in where Sharon talks to him about the fact that the high table people have made upgrades to their armor. And they go out and they're basically bulletproof with their armor. And, that's a really interesting thing to watch John Wick have to deal with, of like, I can't just shoot these guys. And so he's shooting them to like keep one stunned while he like tries to like find a spot where he can shoot the other guy. And then he's like at one point shooting 4 different people to like keep them all down on the ground so he can like take them out one at a time, which in terms of stunt choreography and just like making challenges for the character, that's brilliant, because we've seen that you give him a gun and he's going to take out anyone. You give him a pencil, he'll take out people.
Also noticed, because he finds the weak point by flipping the visors up. That's more for the motorcyclists later.
Yeah.
This is just such an odd but amazing character choice. When John flicks up the visors and shoots someone in the head, he will then flick the visor back down after he's killed them.
It's respectful, you know?
Yeah. This idea of like, it's not just a man with a gun, he can turn anything into a weapon. We've mentioned the horse, the pencil. There's one, he kills like a giant with a library book.
Yes. And then he goes and puts the book back.
Yes.
What?
In the correct place.
Yes.
There's, just to call out that scene in the museum with the knives.
Oh.
Just because I heard the director refer to it as a snowball fight with knives.
I was sitting in, because I went and saw this in cinemas, and I remember that scene and I was just laughing because they're just like reaching in and like throwing knives at each other and none of them are landing properly. They're just like bouncing off. I'm like, what is this?
Yes, she used like 7 knives to kill one guy.
And then at the end he like throws the axe at the guy.
Oh god,
like,
yeah.
What? And I love that you go like, knife shop. Oh, then it's the other people who are trying to fight him, and now it's, the stables, and he kicks a guy in the head with a horse. And then it's like, oh, and now we're on motorbikes.
With swords.
Yeah, why not?
Why not? It's John Wick. Back to myth. It's so easy to just talk about all the amazing stunts.
It is.
In this film. I do like in the second one, we talked about like he goes and gets his car in the second one. Just the whole thing of this film. It's like if you talk to someone about John Wick, they will probably know he stole his car and killed his dog.
Yeah.
That's a myth in itself.
Yeah.
And they remind you of that in the, like we said, in the beginning of the second movie, he goes and gets his car back and he has a new dog. It's a good dog. I
like that in the beginning of the second movie, they like recount like everything, all the myths from the first one. They talk about the like sheer commitment and will, but Abrams says a line to the effect of like, all the stories are true. And if anything, they've been watered down. Yeah,
I had a couple of other things people refer to him as well, like Il Spettro, which means the ghost. He's called Death's very emissary from Gianna. And just like little things in here, like he was given 7 rounds, 7 bullets, and he won with 7 bullets. And we get to kind of enjoy both the man and the myth. Like he's not undefeatable.
No.
He has to, well, he doesn't have to, but he is still under the high table. Winston still has power over him. Like, it's no fun watching a man who can't be beat. And I think because we know he can be, when he succeeds, it's that much more satisfying. Also, he gets very beat up.
Yeah.
He gets hurt a lot.
When I was watching the third movie in the movies, I remember being exhausted by the end of it. Because there's just so much action in the movie. But you're watching John Wick also very exhausted in those last few fights with like Zero's men. And it's just, you're like, he might not win this. Like, because Zero's men take him down, but then out of respect pick him back up and let him, and he's like, give me, just back up.
I've heard a story, I'm pretty sure it's true, that that was just Keanu Reeves. He fell over and it was on film. And it's the actors going to help him up. And he's like, no, I'm fine.
Oh, really?
It might not be true, but that is the story I've heard, and they kept it in the film. And even at the end, like, he doesn't really win. He gets shot and thrown off a building.
And somehow survives.
Yeah, I'm pissed. You're like, oh, shit. Okay, to wrap this up, we're going to our takeaways.
Mm-hmm.
What did we learn from John Wick about how to do a good fantasy movie or script or novel even?
1, not giving more than you need. I think that's probably the key thing is like, give the audience what they need to be engaged with the story and to be interested in the world and to be curious about the world. Make them ask more questions than you give them answers for.
For my takeaway, even if you're writing something like an action or a thriller or a modern thing, like look at how you can incorporate other genres like fantasy. Can you give your characters a distinct way of talking? Can you borrow from ritual? Can you borrow from myth? If you take out all the usual devices for exposition, if you take away the ignorant protagonist, voiceover, titles, the character to talk to, most commonly used by Disney princesses, get the animal sidekick so they can speak their animals out loud. What are some more interesting ways to convey exposition? And do you need to?
Yeah.
To finish off, we are going to just quickly talk about...
predictions for John Wick 4.
Oh, yes. I'll let you go first.
I have no freaking idea. I was reading a website, and there was a bunch of people like talking about what should happen in the next John Wick movie, and they were all terrible. They were like, John Wick should become in charge of the high table. John Wick is not a leader. He would not take out the high table. No, he would take out the high table, but he wouldn't do it in order to do a revolution or anything. He would do it because he needs to survive. I think whatever happens will be John Wick surviving. I don't know where they go from here. I think the Adjudicator is our villain for the next movie. I don't know that any major characters get introduced. I think we have enough major characters. If they keep going, then maybe more come in.
Okay, my theory, and I didn't have this until I did the research for this podcast and looked at it through a fantasy lens, but I think John Wick is going to inadvertently start a revolution. I think there are characters like the Bovary King and Winston who have been waiting for a chance to take the high table down. John Wick has given it to them, and he's going to end up fighting for them, not because he believes in the cause, but if he doesn't do it, he's going to die, which is kind of the reason he's done everything else. So I think there is going to be this massive uprising against the high table. John's going to be at the center of it. There's going to be a lot of headshots. That's my theory for John Wick 4.
Do you think it goes then Hunger Games style? Once that happens, Barry King and Winston, let's say, or the new high table, John ends up killing them as well and just like completely destroying the system. Do you think there's a character change in John Wick, maybe in John Wick 5 or 6, where he actually decides to just end the whole system because maybe they go against John Wick because they're like, well, you're the one person who could stop us, so we're going to take you out?
Maybe. I think either oh my god, this is like Game of Thrones now. I think either the Bovary King or Winston will end up on top, and he will let John go back to his quiet life.
I'm in disagreement there. I don't think anyone lets John go back.
Yeah?
John, I think the rule was that you never leave, and John Wick got to leave once. I don't think he can ever do that again.
Fair enough. I don't think his dog will die.
They better not kill another bloody dog.
The director has said you can kill one dog in your career, and he's done it. So I think that means his new dog is safe.
Good. Thanks for joining us for this episode. If you liked it and want to hear more, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click the bell to receive notifications. We have part 2 of our series on John Wick, as well as episodes on The Platform and Schitt's Creek coming out in the next few months. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or write to us at killthecatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this has been Kill the Cat.
Sorry, Fast and the Furious plans. Love what you love.
Don't love what you love. It's terrible.